We live in a modern-day dopamine economy. Every aspect of our lives is being optimized to stimulate the largest amount of dopamine possible. In her book, Dopamine Nation, Anna Lembke explains how the modern-day dopamine economy promotes addictive behavior and how we can stop it. In this video, I will talk about the main ways dopamine is taking over our lives and how we can take it back. Dopamine stimulating drugs are everywhere. It's made its way into our food with copious amounts of sugar, salt, and fat added to much of the food that we eat. Things that we don't need to survive, but make our modern day monkey brains explode with pleasure. It's made its way into online shopping, with the act of consumption itself becoming a drug. My dad frequently tells me about his issues with stopping his bad habit of surfing Amazon for hours looking at camera lenses. My friends at Cornell are constantly stuck looking at their phones and devices, checking out the most recent TikTok trend or Instagram post. 70% of global deaths are attributable to modifiable behavioral risks like smoking, physical inactivity, and diet. It needs to stop. We have lost the ability to tolerate even the most minor forms of discomfort. Teens today are less capable than ever before of sitting in even a moment of silence. When silence of any sort arises, they instinctively take out their phones and put on music or a podcast or some other form of distraction. Anna brings up the story of Sophie, one of her patients, to make this point. Sophie was caught in a chronic state of noise. She was unwilling to spend any moment of her life in silence. Every walk to class or moment of respite she spent plugged into some music or noise of some sort. Sophie came to Anna looking for help with her constant anxiety issues. Anna immediately noticed that Sophie was running from her thoughts. So instead of prescribing some anxiety medication, Anna told Sophie to spend her walks to class listening to the birds or to the sound of the wind. At first, Sophie said it was agonizingly dull. A few weeks later, however, her anxiety seemed to dampen significantly. Ever since I heard this story, I've doubled down on my walking habits. I spend the morning meditating for 10 minutes, followed by a nice walk out in the sun with nothing in my ear, just silence. It's truly invigorating. We're less happy than ever before. Unfortunately, most people never get to experience the benefits of running toward the world instead of away from it. Instead, many people drown themselves in pills, couch surf while binge watching Netflix movies, or fall into a food addiction. We will do almost anything to distract ourselves from ourselves. According to the World Happiness Report, which ranks 156 countries by how happy their citizens perceive themselves to be, people living in the United States reported being less happy in 2018 than in 2008. But if technology is getting better and famine and drought are becoming less prominent, why is this happening? Anna believes that the reason we're all so miserable is that we are working so hard to avoid being miserable. If we want to understand why everyone is so unhappy in this modern day economy, we must first understand how dopamine works in the brain. Most people think of dopamine as the pleasure hormone, when it's actually the motivation hormone. Dopamine plays a much bigger role in the motivation to get a reward than the pleasure of the reward itself. Dopamine is what gets me to grab up, walk to the pantry, and grab some of that sweet peanut butter that is just oh so delicious. In addition to this discovery, neuroscientists have discovered that pleasure and pain process in overlapping brain regions via an opponent processing system. If we experience something insanely pleasurable, then the balance of the pathway is shifted towards the side of pleasure. The problem comes because the balance wants to remain level. Hence, every time we tip the scale toward the pleasure or pain side, there will be a corresponding shift toward the opposite at some point. If we do something particularly pleasurable, we'll have a subsequent bout of depression or a less pleasurable state in the hours or days afterward. I failed to consider this when I first started going to the gym. I wanted to make my gym session as pleasurable as possible, so I experimented. I already enjoyed working out, but then added on the bonus of drinking pre-workout beforehand. Pre-workout has an ingredient in it known as tyrosine, a precursor to dopamine. I combined all of this with a music playlist during the workout and a meal right afterward. The culmination of these things led to insane pleasure spike during my workout. However, I noticed that in the afternoons or evenings, I always seem to be a little bit less happy. Nothing too bad, but noticeable. As I went through my gym routine more and more, I received less and less pleasure from what had given me so much just months before. So what did I do in response? More pre-workout, louder music, and a bigger meal afterward. I could not stop. My body had gone through something called neuroadaptation. With repeated exposure to the same stimulus, the initial deviation to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and the after response to the side of pain gets stronger and longer in a process known as neuroadaptation. The paradox is that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, leads to anhedonia, which is the inability to enjoy the pleasure of any kind. The exact thing that happened because of my gym session. Another very popular saying in neuroscience is that neurons that fire together wire together. This means that neurons associated with a particular reward pathway become more ingrained. In a process known as myelination, fat slowly builds up around the nerves and makes them easier to fire. The stronger the nerves associated with a bad habit are myelinated, the harder it is for us to resist the urge to perform the habit that it's associated with. It's the difference between someone who gets dessert every now and then and someone who feels a deep craving to have dessert every single night. It's why people that get over an addiction can still fall back into it again, months, or even years down the line. Although some changes to addiction are permanent, it's possible to detour these damaged areas by creating new neural networks. We can find synaptic pathways to create healthy behaviors. If we wait long enough, our brains adapt to the absence of the drug and we reestablish baseline homeostasis. Usually. This allows us to once again get pleasure out of simple everyday rewards. Walking outside in nature, eating a meal with friends, reading a book. So we now know that dopamine affects our motivation and happiness on a pleasure-pain balance. The question that remains is how we can reset our reward pathways to take pleasure in simple things. The answer is through a process called dopamine fasting. And it gives a framework in the book that we can use to try and get out of the addictive state that most of us are in. It's pretty easy to remember because it goes with the acronym dopamine. I think it's fun if we went through the framework using my addiction to chamomile tea as an example. The D in dopamine stands for data. It entails gathering the simple facts of consumption. I drink probably a good 3 or 4 cups of chamomile a day. The O in dopamine stands for objective. It comes with identifying the objective someone has with addictive behavior. I drink chamomile tea because of how relaxed it makes me feel while reading or writing. I also put 1 packet of stevia in it, which is one of my guilty pleasures. The P in dopamine stands for problems related to use. Drinking 5 cups of chamomile tea a day, along with coffee and water, makes bathroom trips agonizing. I also spend more time than I'm willing to admit in front of the water boiler, waiting for the water to be ready. The A in dopamine stands for abstinence. Abstinence is necessary to restore homeostasis and get pleasure from everyday things again. I should probably start by reducing my consumption to around 2 cups per day instead of 4 to 5. I might also abstain from using stevia in the drink as it makes it more appealing to drink. The M of dopamine stands for mindfulness. This is simply being mindful of how your body feels during the fast. Are you craving the thing that you're fasting from? What thoughts are going through your head? It's essential to be mindful that you will feel worse in the beginning after starting your dopamine fast. After about 4 weeks, however, you should feel much better in most cases. I don't think it would take me 4 weeks to get through my chamomile tea addiction, as it's not that severe, but it is pretty bad, I will admit. The I of dopamine stands for insight. If I went through my chamomile tea fast, I might notice other addictions that I never knew I had. The N of dopamine stands for next steps. This comes with asking yourself what you'll do after you've successfully gone through the fast. I would probably keep drinking chamomile tea, but in less insane amounts, maybe only 2 cups a day and without stevia. The E and final letter of dopamine stands for experiment. This is where you go back into the world with a new pleasure-pain set balance and a plan for maintaining it. It's important to realize that just because you succeed in the short term with enacting the dopamine process, you can still fall back into the addiction at a moment's notice. Many addicts have gone clean and then suddenly got back into the addiction from one lousy day, even years later. So that was the dopamine framework. I ended up using it to help with my chamomile addiction, and it has been going splendidly, down to only 2 cups a day. I encourage you to go to the description and download the edible Dopamine Framework PDF so that you can work on your own addictions. What we need now are actual protocols and actionable tips that we can use to help us during our fasting journey. Self-binding is a set of 3 strategies that you can use to help in your dopamine fasting efforts. They include physical strategies, chronological strategies, and categorical strategies. Physical self-binding works by making it physically harder to access the drug or enact the addictive behavior. One classic example of this is in Homer's Odyssey. One of the main dangers that awaited Odysseus on his journey from the Trojan War was the sirens, half woman, half bird creatures whose enchanted song lured sailors to their death on the rocky cliffs of nearby islands. The only way sailors could pass the sirens unharmed was by listening to them sing. In an act of physical self-binding, Odysseus ordered his crew to put beeswax in their ears and tie him to the mast of the sailing ship, binding him even tighter if he ever put up a commotion or struggle. The idea was that by physically binding himself to the ship, he wouldn't be able to fall for the call of the sirens during their voyage. This strategy can be useful in real life as well. Let's run through some easy examples you can probably relate to. Unplugging the TV and putting it in your closet after use. Banishing your game console to your garage, only bringing with you cash when you go out instead of credit cards. Putting your chocolate in the back of the cupboard. Another form of self-binding is chronological self-binding, which restricts consumption to certain times of the day, week, month, or year. For example, I never drink coffee past 1 p.m. This is a chronological self-binding I've made for myself that will help me get better sleep at night. You can do this in other ways as well. For example, you can tell yourself you'll only consume on the holidays, only on weekends, never before 5 p.m., never before Thursdays, etc. The reason it's so hard to stick to routines like this is because of a psychological phenomenon known as delay discounting. Delay discounting refers to the fact that the value of a reward goes down the longer we have to wait for it. Most of us would rather get $20 today than a year from now. We get around this by setting in feedback loops that remind us of our bad behavior. One easy way to do this is by tracking the amount of time you spend consuming and using it to set chronological barriers more mindfully. A couple of weeks ago, I was working out at the gym when one of my good Cornell friends came up to me and put his hand on my left shoulder. I turned around to face him and his phone was opened up to the time tracking app. The average amount of time spent on his phone during the days of the week was 3.5. Why are you showing me this? I asked. He explained that it was 2.5 hours less on average than the last couple of weeks. He had watched one of my videos on time tracking and decided to give it a shot. Whenever he spent too much time using TikTok or some other phone application, it became abundantly clear when he checked his screen time app later that day. He looked at me with genuine happiness and said that he now had an extra 2.5 hours every day to do what he wanted. Time that he didn't even know was there. That right there is the power of awareness. The last form of self-binding works by sorting dopamine into different categories. The subtypes that we allow ourselves to consume and the subtypes that we don't. This strategy is beneficial for drugs that we can't eliminate altogether, but we're trying to consume more healthily, like food, sex, and smartphones. Some classic examples include diets like veganism, carnivorism, or vegetarianism. Some other examples are that we aren't allowed to play gambling games on our phones, but can play Snake to pass the time. I used to be addicted to watching YouTube all the time. I would watch it before school, during study halls, and before going to bed at night. To curb my addiction, I gave myself a rule. I was only allowed to watch YouTube if I was running. This not only reduced my dependence on YouTube, but made my running habit more fun as well. Now, we've talked about some of the ways that we can reduce pleasure to reset our dopamine levels. But what if we attack it the other way around? What if we try and increase pain as well? Earlier, we talked about how dopamine works on a pleasure-pain balance. When tipped towards one side of the balance, we'll be more prone to tip towards the other side in the coming hours and days. Using this fact, we can use pain to shift the balance towards pleasure. Pain leads to pleasure by triggering the body's own regulating homeostatic mechanisms. In this case, the initial pain stimulus is followed by a tip towards the pleasure side of the balance. I take a cold shower every night before sitting down to read some books. Cold exposure exposure therapy for just 5 minutes has been shown to increase the average dopamine levels in the body by up to 2.5 times over the coming hours. Exercise does the same thing in the body. While we're exercising, we experience drastically increased levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which often leads to us feeling pain during the exercise bout itself. In the hours afterward, even people who hate exercise have to admit they feel way better. Just as we become tolerant to pleasurable stimuli with repeated exposure, so too can we become tolerant to painful stimuli, resetting our brain to the side of pain. That's right. You can literally get addicted to pain. This phenomenon happened to me when I got addicted to seeing my 5K time increase during the first semester at Cornell. It got to the point where I was attempting to beat it every other day, to the extreme detriment of my ability to recover effectively. At one point, I managed to get it down to 18:15, but because I wasn't willing to wait long enough between runs, I never got past that point. I had become so addicted to the number that I was seeing on the treadmill, I forgot to allow myself time to recover. The beautiful thing about fixing your dopamine levels is it's a contagious process. When one person succeeds in the recovery from addiction, it can often lead to their friend group adopting new behaviors or their family are trying to do so. I've noticed insane differences in my friends and family from who they were just months ago. Dopamine fasting isn't an isolating experience. It's actually an incredibly social one. Be sure to check out my videos on how to build and break habits using neuroscience. You can use it to expand your knowledge of habit change from this video. Get Dopamine Nation for yourself in the description below if you enjoyed the video. As always, have a fantastic day and bye-bye.